Sri Lanka. Since I was not welcomed in India, I decided to go to Sri Lanka instead, due to its similar culture and to the fact that the island has served as a test tube for the UN's population control methods. But first and foremost, since I can visit Sri Lanka without a visa as a Romanian citizen. To be frank, my love of islands and beaches was also a determining factor, as well as its relative proximity to the UAE, as it requires only a 4.5-hour flight. As I expected, Sri Lanka is beautiful but poor. What I didn't expect is that it is also poorly governed, the result of which the country has a lot of problems, big and small. I identified three major problems. First, it is grossly overpopulated and it can no longer grow all the food it needs despite its favorable climate and fertile soil and plenty of water. It has a population density of 338 people per square kilometer. That's more than 3 times higher than Europe's, and is therefore the 24th most densely populated country in the world and has 13.6 million more people than it can sustainably support out of a total population of 22.2 million. Consequently, in order to reach sustainability, Sri Lanka must decrease its population by 61%. 2, it has no energy sources of its own and little money with which to import oil and gas, the result of which the country is in the midst of an energy crisis, and petrol is strictly rationed, 14 liters per car per week, and can only be purchased by QR code. This will hamper its economic development and impoverish the population even further. And 3, it is poorly governed, so much so that one has the impression it is not governed at all. It also has 3 minor problems that, unless addressed, will grow into major ones. First, it has a stray dog infestation problem that results in 350,000 dog bites annually and 42 deaths by rabies, and that is totally unacceptable. 2, it lacks urban planning and any development planning whatsoever, or long-term plans for that matter, the result of which the natural beauty of the country is being ruined and chaos reigns. 3, its people are mired in religious superstitions, and the Buddhist concept of karma prevents them from taking a resolute action on the human and canine population control fronts. Europe is helping Sri Lanka cope with its overpopulation problem by opening its doors to Sri Lankans to work in the EU and by issuing work permits in ever larger numbers. My own country, Romania, is now host to thousands of Sri Lankans whose presence over the past 2 years has grown by leaps and bounds. 1.7 million Sri Lankans now work abroad. That's almost 10% of the population. 500,000 in the Americas and 400,000 in Europe, and the rest are scattered around the globe. The remittances they send home act as a financial buttress and save the country from economic collapse. But unless population growth is stopped dead in its tracks and the country goes into depop mode within a couple of years, it will never climb out of poverty and will destroy the environment, and with it tourism, which is one of the country's main sources of income at 13% of GDP. And the only way in which its majority Buddhist population will accept limits to life is through a global population stabilization law. Due to overpopulation, Sri Lanka has reached a critical point: the loss of its self-sufficiency in rice production, which it had since 2005. Even though rice comprises 40% of the country's total crop production, Sri Lanka has had to import 550,000 metric tons of rice in 2022 to cover its domestic needs. Once the population decreases, the demand for fossil fuels will decrease too, the rationing of petrol will stop, and economic activity and prosperity will increase. Given how overpopulated and densely populated the country is, I cannot see it becoming a renewable energy powerhouse anytime soon, simply because it lacks the empty land where it can place large solar farms and windmills. What it can do, however, is to put a solar roof on every house and build solar roadways and streets. I see no other way in which Sri Lanka can become energy independent, which it must. Offshore wind farms and wave energy can also help. It has wind and waves aplenty. In terms of governance, the country would be better off to allow a team of technocrats to govern the country until it is out of the mess it is in, which will take at least 30 years. In the meantime, it can start educating the young in civic duty and build a civil society. As for its minor problems, it can solve its dog infestation by simply catching and euthanizing all stray dogs. The country cannot afford to sterilize 3 million dogs and then feed them until they die of natural causes. Besides, sterilized or not, they will still pose a public safety issue and endanger the lives of all Sri Lankan children. And if Sri Lanka wants to build up its tourist industry, or at least keep it as it is, it must also euthanize all its dogs. No tourist wants to spend his or her vacation fending stray dogs and fearing to step out of the hotel lest they get bit by a rabies-infested dog. Environmentally too, the dogs must all be killed as they ravage the wildlife, which is already strained by overpopulation. In terms of urban planning, unless the people come to an agreement at the local level to tear down all buildings erected along the beaches and move all commercial and residential structures on the far side of the coastal roads, there will be nothing left of the splendor of its beaches, and tourism will simply die out. Sri Lanka cannot afford to lose tourism income. It must, in fact, make it the mainstay of its economy. It must impose strict building codes to make the buildings attractive enough to complement the natural beauty, especially since the entire coastline is basically an uninterrupted linear city. The religious superstitions that handicap the people from controlling the growth of the canine and human populations can only be deleted from the country's culture by its spiritual leaders, who must come out of the temples and out of hiding from the world and change the doctrines and teachings of their religions, be they Buddhist, Hindu, Muslim, or Christian, to make them relevant to the existential problems of today. Since 70% of the population is Buddhist, it is particularly important that Sri Lanka's Buddhist spiritual leaders properly interpret the concept of karma to show that allowing the canine and human population to grow unrestricted has far more negative effects, both individually and socially, than restricting them. The nation's spiritual leaders must also start preparing the population for the inevitable required assisted dying, RAD, component of a population stabilization law that will kick in as soon as the country's old age dependency ratio climbs above 20%. And since it is already at 18%, there is no time to waste. A country as poor as Sri Lanka cannot afford to support a large percentage of elderly. Currently, the country has no universal pension system, which leaves many vulnerable elders without an income, homeless, and penniless. The National Secretariat for Elders, the government body that implements welfare programs for older people, is providing a temporary monthly allowance for more than 650,000 people, according to its director, KG Lanarol. But that is no solution either for the country or for its elderly, since Sri Lanka has the fastest growing aging population in South Asia, and by 2041, people over 60 years old will rise to 1 in 4. It currently has more than 1 in 6. As it is, Director KG Lanarol has publicly stated that, and I quote, "The growth of the elder population has grown to the point where it is a social problem," end of quote. In fact, it is a social disaster and long past the point of being merely a social problem. The country does have free and near universal health coverage, but lacks the capacity to provide proper medical care, especially to elderly people with chronic conditions. I witnessed this myself when I visited a lovely Canadian lady who invited me to her B&B in Udawalawa, a place in the mountains. She and her staff have been stuck for weeks caring for an abandoned old and sick Buddhist monk that no monastery would take in and no hospital would care for. The social services the government of Sri Lanka provides look very good on paper, but are terrible or unavailable in reality. Furthermore, despite its light social entitlements load, the country is dependent on IMF bailouts, the last one for 2.9 billion, and dependent also on foreign aid. This is the sign of a country that cannot govern itself and of a people who lack the political maturity to govern themselves. Let's be honest. My policy prescription for the Sri Lankan people and government are as follows. 1. Implement my population stabilization law without delay and insist on its universal application worldwide as the law of the world. In this fashion, you will stabilize and decrease your population and set yourselves on a path to a sustainable population 50 years down the road. 2. Install a solar roof on every building in the country, be it commercial or residential, and transform all streets, roads, and highways into solar power generating plants to reach energy independence 50 years down the road. 3. Allow a team of technocrats, be they foreign or domestic, to assume command and control over your country's governance to free the political sphere from corruption and ineptitude. 4. Cull your stray dogs, all 3 million of them. Institute a strict urban planning regime to restructure your development and save your natural wealth. And get your spiritual leaders out of the temples to do the work they are supposed to do, namely provide clear and resolute moral and ethical direction to the country to immediately address the dire existential problems you face, rather than leaving it all to fate. For if you continue to leave it all to fate, you'll end up killing each other for the last grain of rice and eat every stray dog you have to avoid starvation. Unless my policy prescriptions are implemented without delay, Sri Lanka will collapse due to famine within the next 10 years, and civil war will ravage the country.